things happen.
It's all
So
good. It's all good. You're here for the last one. So,
yeah,
and there's recordings. So you can always listen to the recordings, right?
right.
For the other two. But good to see you again. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. I was just saying, as people start to join, this is our last class together for the bioremediation course. So it's been 6 weeks together, and we're going to be wrapping things up today. By no means is this kind of the entirety of what needs to be learned about bioremediation, but it's just the introduction that we could fit into 6 weeks. And hopefully it's gotten folks excited about all the other things that can be learned and maybe places where you want to deepen your knowledge. So excited to keep that going. I'm just going to give folks a few minutes to hop on, and I hope everyone is well this evening. And again, I guess for the last time that we're all together, please feel free to put in the chat where you're joining from, whose territories you're joining from. I am in a different place today. Often I'm joining you from Canada, but I am actually up in Northern California, and I'm on the traditional territories of the Pit River tribes and the Adjamawi and the Atsagewe people, somewhere between Mount Shasta and Mount Lassen. So excited to be at a different part of the continent and to wrap up the course. Yeah, but put your where you're joining in the chat, acknowledge your territories, and we will get started.
Leela, in North Carolina, are you hitting up Natalie at Ball Abundance?
I'm in California.
Oh, in California. I just looked at
Yes,
my heads. I didn't see.
Northern California, not North
Okay.
Carolina. Although I love North Carolina and I would love to get out east. I miss the South and Appalachia way too much. It's been a minute since I've been there. I usually pick places I can drive from Western Canada. That's a little too far.
Makes sense.
But yeah. All right, so let's get started, everybody. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. We have a pretty packed class. We have 2 or 3 very different topics to kind of cover in this class. And then we're going to have some good time at the end for question and answer. And so a few things. We're going to talk in this class, we are going to talk about kind of, starting bioremediation projects. What does that look like? We're going to talk about soil testing and do a quick introduction to soil testing. There's some people on this class who know a lot about it. And I think for some people, this might be the first time you're hearing about it. So we're going to just introduce that as well, because you need to know a bit about soil testing to do this work. And then we're going to hop over and start talking about self-care and how do we keep ourselves healthy when we are doing this work in terms of being in contaminated spaces, around contaminated places, being impacted by, chemical spills, fires, legacy pollution, all that stuff. We'll talk about a few ways to support our bodies. And then we're going to do Q&A, and then we're going to round out the class, hopefully, if we have enough time. Maya Elson has generously offered to kind of round things out with a mycopsychology somatic exercise, just to get groovy and to kind of take all the brain stuff and bring it into our bodies. So that's how we're going to end it. And then we'll all go our merry ways and hopefully stay in touch. But that is what we have on tap for today. And again, as I'll say, as we're covering different topics, if questions come up for you, put them in the chat, and then we will hit it in question and answer period. Because I want to make sure we get through the material. And so we'll kind of hit the questions at the end. So we have been talking a lot about different, folks have been sharing about their bioremediation projects. We've been giving examples of different bioremediation projects. But I just wanted to share just a few key pieces. If you're starting one or you want to do this work, some really important things to keep in mind when it comes to doing bioremediation. So first of all, different steps to starting a bioremediation project. First of all, important to organize what I call your remediation dream team, and we'll talk about that in a second. But who are you going to do this work with? And having some different skill sets, some folks who have complementary differences on that team. Really understanding the site, the place that you're working to do healing work on, whose site is it? Whose land is it? What has happened on that site? What has happened on that land? And the history can tell you a lot about kind of the contaminants and the damage and inform some of what needs to be done. And there are some situations where people can't afford to do soil testing because it's expensive, and they have to rely pretty much on what they know in terms of the history of the site to come up with their remediation plan. And so that's a really important step. It's important to find funding for this work. We mentioned in the beginning of this course, there's different types of remediation. There's conventional remediation and there's bioremediation. And the more corporate conventional remediation is incredibly expensive. And community bioremediation is a lot cheaper, but it's not free. And the costs for that tend to be mainly in things like soil testing, water testing, and contaminant testing. But it also is different materials that we have to use, paying people to do this work as well, so people can be compensated for their labor. So funding and donations is an important part of having a great bioremediation project. Doing soil and or water testing, again, can give you so much information about where to go and what remediation strategies to pick. And then doing a site assessment. And we'll talk about number 4 and number 5 a bit more in detail, but really getting on your site and looking for clues and trying to understand, again, what has happened here? What are we seeing on that site, and how can that inform the project and the work we're going to do? When it comes to doing phytoremediation projects, after we've figured out all those other pieces, like we have our dream team, we've done the site history, we've done the site assessment, we have some funding, we know maybe because of soil testing what we have in terms of contamination. That allows us to determine what are we going to do for remediation? What are the strategies that we're going to use? And, we've been talking about microbial remediation, phytoremediation, biochar, microremediation. How are you going to work with those on your site? You might not work with all of those. Your site, it may not make sense to maybe work with mushrooms, or it might not make sense to work with biochar or plants. But looking at your site and really putting kind of the place first and what the land needs first, really figuring out kind of what do you want to work with? Do you want to do it, in sequence? Are you working with multiple things at once? Are you working with them sequentially? That's where you really figure that piece out. And you're informed again by knowing what happened on that site. And if you have the funding, what is actually in that soil that you're trying to deal with. Now, after you've kind of figured out that plan, you want to engage community. And you could also engage community while you're trying to figure out that plan. But a lot of these remediation projects, unless it's in your own backyard, you are doing it in community and in a collective space of some sort, and people are interacting with it. And so it's really important for people to understand what you're doing, right? Community, neighbors, necessary allies. And if we don't engage people, they can become opposition. If they don't understand the work we're doing, there can be situations where they try to stop it, or they don't understand it, and let's say they take out plants, or they cut things down, or they try to eat the remediation plants. Like, it's just really good to really engage people and let them know what's going on. And then after that, we get into doing the work itself. And most contaminated sites, we have to do an initial site cleanup potentially. Maybe there's debris and kind of obvious things that need to be kind of cleared and moved to kind of get started and really be able to access that soil. And then we just start preparing the site, getting our materials together, and then we plant, we spawn, and we inoculate, or whatever combination of that is needed in that space. And then once that is happening, again, it's a process that keeps going. It's dynamic, it grows, we learn things, we add things, we change things. And all the while we're doing that, we are maintaining kind of community outreach and community engagement. We're welcoming people to understand what's happening in that space. And hopefully even trying to bring people along the ride in terms of learning with us as we do it. We're creative and we're inclusive in the work. And I've seen some really amazing things when people are creative when it comes to this work. It can create a more welcoming space and kind of really bring in different people and have them understand the importance of healing the land and also caring for sites that might have become sacrifice zones, or that we might be ignoring for a reason, and we need to kind of bring them some love again. So those are just kind of the different things to think about when you're starting a project. Now, just going a bit more into depth, when we're talking about dream team. And again, everybody's different, every project is different, but I just wanted to share a few skills that are important to have in terms of if you can bring together the right people, because often the right people will allow you to do the work. You want to have folks on your team who really like to work with soil. Ideally, they're people who have great composting skills. Maybe they've taken a soil food web training or a master composter training. They're folks who really know how to rock microorganisms and bring that into the mix. Those folks can be invaluable when it comes to microbial remediation. You also want to have folks who are good at growing plants, especially when it comes to native plants, which are harder to grow sometimes in terms of they have some different strategies that they need to get going. Maybe the person who's really good at plants, they either have a green thumb or they have worked on farms, or maybe they are connected to a nursery. Something like that is a really important skill set because it makes a lot of things possible, especially since we know sites can be hard for plants. If they're contaminated and they're damaged and they're degraded, the better people are with knowing how to work with these allies, the better chance they have of actually succeeding. Having somebody on your team who is excited about mushrooms, maybe they're, an amateur mycologist, they're just starting to learn about mushrooms, maybe they're kind of growing mushrooms in their garage or their basement, or maybe they're a mushroom farmer and they have, an ability to really bring a lot of spawn to the mix. That's an important person to have, who can, again, knowing somebody who's good at mushroom cultivation allows you to have a whole different set of skills in a project in terms of even being able to take different forms of contamination and adapt different species or strains of fungi to break them down and utilize very specific strains. Or someone who understands how to cultivate mushrooms knows how to wild cultivate and knows how to go take species that are from the wild and kind of bring them into cultivation so that you're not working with some store species or, something you ordered online. You're actually working with a fungi from that region, right? So that's mushroom growers or mushroom cultivators are a really good person to have in your mix. And it's a bonus if you have someone who loves biochar and who likes to play with biochar, who is a biochar enthusiast. If you have those skill sets, you can do a lot when it comes to remediation. And even if you don't have all of them, having people who you are in relation with who want to support your project, who might have some of these skill sets, is important. Often we see sometimes people tend to group up, like all the soil people get together, all the mushroom people get together, and they're not necessarily cross-pollinating. And so I think the strongest teams are the ones where you have multiple different skill sets. Also people who have soil testing experience. Soil testing is complex, and understanding soil testing, understanding toxicology is, it takes some knowledge and some training. And so if you have someone on your team who has that, that's a wonderful skill set to have. Even things like people who know how to really fundraise and write grants, who know how to community organize, folks who have connections with the government or with different universities. That can be very helpful to getting permission, to getting legitimacy, to getting access to free resources. And the list goes on. And I think feel free to add, if there's any skills that you think are missing from this list, add them in the chat. I didn't want to put everything on there, but I think the big point here is that when we come together and we have multiple different skills trying to heal a site and do this work, and it's not just one type, it's not just all people who are mushroom folks or all people who are plant folks, we end up with the ability to do this multi-species, multi-trophic remediation because people can look at it with different eyes and actually come up with things that work together instead of being a little bit too siloed. So trying to, again, find that and call that into your remediation crew is very important. And even if not everybody has that now, maybe even picking who's going to go after what skill set and bring that into their knowledge base. Now, I mentioned funding as being a really important thing with remediation projects. And again, depending on how resourceful you are, you can sometimes make it really with very little, but we do need funding for things like soil testing. That is the biggest dollar kind of need in remediation because it's not cheap and you can't always find free sources of soil testing. We need funding for tools and equipment for, if we're trying to get really cool, big actively aerated compost tea brewers, or we're getting some of the materials we need for mushroom cultivation. If we're trying to buy irrigation, like this costs money, right? Seed and plant starts, important to have some funding for that. Spawn and cultivation materials, really good to have funding for that as well. And we might need things like fencing and signage. And some of these things can come from, again, a lot of DIY, reusing and repurposing, and donations and relationships, right? If you have a really good relationship with a mushroom farmer, you can get lots of spent spawn. If you have a really good relationship with a biochar producer, they might give you biochar for free. There's ways to kind of get this for free, but it's also good to have some funding to make it a bit easier and to also reimburse these folks so that when you really need it for free, like in a disaster or something like that, then you can use it in that way. And in terms of funding sources, thinking really open. I already mentioned like in-kind donations, but there are different government grants, different watershed stewardship and conservation organizations will sometimes throw money at things like this. Different foundations and nonprofits, universities, again, if you have a cool university near you, that's a really good way to get either funding or this in-kind kind of support, especially when it comes to things like soil testing. And that is, I would say, priceless if you can get that free soil testing and things like that from a university. And then there are private companies who sometimes will step up and want to fund these things. I have a colleague who does microbial remediation more than the other types, and she made a relationship with a private soil lab that has been giving her lots of free testing, like not a university, an actual private soil lab that was like, we love what you're doing. This is our contribution, right? So you got to think openly in terms of all the folks who are willing to fund. And I'll say, obviously, forgot to add this, but crowdfunding can go a long way. Communities can like really step up for this work as well. So, lots of ways to get that funding. But I will say funding can be this limiting factor, especially to getting started. So we see a lot of bioremediation projects want to start by soil testing. And they get stuck at that stage because they don't have the funding to test the soil. And so therefore they don't go forward, they don't go ahead. And so that's why it's important to be like, at least try to get yourself like $5,000, $10,000 or whatever to get some of that work going, or have that amazing relationship with a university to see if you can get some of that for free. Now, I also mentioned community engagement. So again, if we are doing these bioremediation projects and it's in a public area, it's really important to build support and allies for the project. Because bioremediation is not conventional remediation, sometimes governments don't like it, or they get a bit prickly about some of the different pieces with it. They don't understand what's going on. Sometimes neighbors don't like it. And so you don't want to have any of that, because if you do, then they can actually squash your project or cause you lots of problems. So it is really important to really try to educate people, build support, and build that allyship. And also that allyship can open doors in terms of permits and resources and testing and things like that. First and foremost, wherever you're doing this work, engage with the indigenous communities whose lands you are on, and ask for permission, right? And see if there's kind of any work to be done, or people want to be involved, or what's the best way to proceed. And if a community doesn't have time or doesn't want to engage, that's fine, but you have to ask, you have to, I think, make that attempt to really do it in a good way. So that's a good place to start. And then, as I mentioned before, partner if you can. Again, this isn't individual bioremediation. You're doing your own thing, you're doing your own backyard or whatever. You're not going to have universities being like, I want to help you. But if you're doing bigger projects that are community projects, you can reach out to different universities in your area and see, especially if they have a soil department and they do agricultural testing or anything like that, to see if they're willing to provide you with free testing or give you access to other things. Or if they want some grad students to assist, and you can kind of get some extra support that way. It's a pretty good thing to work with, and it adds legitimacy to your work, also in the eyes of the community and the government. And then, as I also mentioned, again, making those alliances and those relationships with local nurseries and composters, native plant groups, arborists. Arborists are our friends when it comes to any kind of microremediation work, because you want their wood chips. And if you have a hookup with an arborist, you can get some really good stuff, and you get it like when you want it and how you want it. So that's a really good thing to be thinking about. And just thinking about all the possibilities of like, what do we need for some of that in-kind donation when it comes to materials and support. Now, again, engaging and educating the local community, the neighborhood associations. I was working with this one group in Baltimore that was doing a phytoremediation project in a neighborhood, and they were actively, flyering, meeting with the neighborhood association, letting them know what they were doing, and also hearing their concerns and working to address their concerns, right? And before it became a problem. And as a result, they had a really good relationship. And that neighborhood association became a proponent for the project and was really excited and started kind of doing work with them. So again, bringing people in early. A lot of times when people are opposed to something, it's because they don't understand it, or they're worried about safety. So one of the biggest things with bioremediation is people see you on a site, they find out that it might be contaminated, and then all of a sudden they're worried about pets and children, and what if people start eating the things and it becomes this big deal. And so again, kind of coming to, again, neighborhood people, to government folks, and being ready with those safety questions and being ready to say, this is what we're going to do to keep people safe or to keep the wildlife safe before they have to ask you is really important. And sometimes that's as, simple as signage and fencing, or saying that you're going to cut the heads off all the sunflowers, or, remove the mushrooms when they fruit, something like that. It's not that big a deal, but just really letting people know, or saying that, when people are on site, you're wearing PPE, you're taking the proper precautions. But if people see you doing something where it's on land that's contaminated and you don't seem to have any concern for safety, that's usually a red flag for any permitting agency or even neighborhood kind of association. So you want to be a bit ahead of that. And folks are always worried about pets and children. So think about how you're going to keep those two special, I think, groups safe. And again, things you can distribute pamphlets, you can, create signage that really educates people as to what's going on. There's another story from the same group in Baltimore where they did their phytoremediation project on the site, and they started off by planting brown mustard, because brown mustard is a really good phytoplant for pulling up heavy metals. And they were really excited. The mustard was going great. And then they came back to their site one day and the city had mowed down the mustard because they thought it was a weed. And they just were like, thought they were taking care of a weed field and a blighted area and were just going for it. And so after that group switched to sunflowers, which I always think is sad, because I'm like, there are species of plants that are better than sunflowers, but we actually see folks actually work with sunflowers a lot in urban areas because it holds the space in a different way and people like how it looks. And that in itself gets less opposition, right? And so if they'd had signage, if they'd maybe been engaging with the city in a certain way, maybe that wouldn't have happened. But after that, they went the sunflower route and they never had a problem after that. Like it worked really well. They did a lot of art projects and things to really anchor the space and make it a really beautiful place to be. And that kind of shifted the energy with it. So lots of different things to consider. I mentioned art projects, really good. If you have creative people in your group or in your community, invite them in to be a part of this, because they can do incredible things that, again, open up that space and get, people excited about it. So yeah, that's the community engagement piece. Now I want to go back in that list of like things you got to do for the projects and talk about kind of the site assessment and soil testing. These are two things that we probably should have talked about in the beginning of the course, but we left it for now. As I mentioned, it is really important when you're starting a project to really spend time on your site and figure out kind of what happened there and what's currently going on there and what's kind of going on under the surface in terms of the toxicity, the contamination, the biology. All of those things will give you the information you need to figure out what are your next steps and what remediation remedies to actually work with. So the site assessment is very much like being on that site and really observing and really kind of trying to see what's going on. And there's also this pre-component that's about research, like trying to figure out like what has happened here before, asking neighbors, looking at historical records, like did there used to be any kind of industrial use on the site? Did it used to be a dumping ground? Was there structures here that burned in the past? Like it's amazing to kind of see what's happened to places over, decades and centuries. And that history is really critical to know. I was working on a project in Chicago where the site looked fine. And we talked to a few neighbors and they said, yeah, no, it's always been pretty like nothing to see here. No houses burned down or anything. And then we talked to this one elderly lady on the street, who's the oldest one on the street, who said that people used to dump cars and bury cars on that site, right? Good that we talked to her. So it's important to, again, like there's a lot of things you can find out by going to kind of city records, by looking at old pictures of a site, by talking to people who've been around and who are historians, and also just people in the neighborhood can actually share quite a bit about what's happened. And given what some of those historical uses are, that will also tell you what contaminants to expect. And if you can't afford soil tests, that might be the only thing that's going to tell you whether you should be concerned about a strategy for metals or for chemicals. In one of your resources on the Mighty Network, on the course page, I have a whole thing on different contaminants. It's a slideshow, and it goes through some of the different contaminants, like different metals, and why you might find them in different places because of the different uses on a site. And so that can be really helpful to being like, there might be lead here because there was this happening, or cadmium because of a coal production facility nearby, or something like that. That can give you a lot of information. Now, in addition to the history, also walking around that site and considering, like, how does the soil actually look? Is that soil, is it dark or discolored? Does there look like there's like actually staining of the soil? And that could mean the presence of contaminants, like some kind of spill. What is the soil texture? Does the soil look healthy? Is there any life in it? Is it really compacted? Does it look more like dust, or does it actually look like soil? Are there things like worms and spiders and things like that? Like, if you don't have worms and other kind of larger insects in that soil, chances are you really are missing a lot of your beneficial bacteria and fungi and kind of those lower kind of trophic levels of the soil food web. So, what is actually happening in the soil, right? Are you dealing with something that's in trouble, or is it doing okay, right? Also looking at what plants are on that site. Are there plants growing on that site? Do you have giant bald spots where there's nothing growing? And again, kind of like those dark discolored stain spots, if you have spots where it's like nothing's growing, that can be indicative of either major soil damage in terms of compaction and no biology, or actual contamination, right? And so it's important to kind of mark these hot spots, or these potential hot spots, to say, hey, maybe we want to test here, or maybe if we can't test, this is where we want to focus some of our efforts. And if there are plants on your site, who's showing up? Because the type of plants that show up can mean different things, right? We know that there are certain plants that are indicators of more acidic soil or more alkaline soil, or some plants do a bit better in toxic spaces, and some plants you won't find in those toxic sites. And so even kind of seeing who's showing up to do the work, if you're seeing a lot of phytoremediator plants that you kind of normally would be like, hey, I would use that to clean up a site, that might be an indication that, nature is responding and doing something. I don't know if folks remember from the phytoremediation, or one of our other presentations, no, it was microbial, our class on microbial remediation, but we heard from Mohammed Saleh in Palestine. And he was talking about how where they had a lot of the tear gas and the kind of the tear gas canisters impact the soil, that was where mustard was growing really intensely and where milk thistle was growing really intensely, right? So taking notice of these things just as both a clue and kind of to understand a bit what's going on. Similarly with the fungi, are there fungi on your site? Can you see them? And if you got some, like, let's say there's an oyster mushroom growing on your site, that would be a really good mushroom to kind of cultivate, kind of take some wild tissue and kind of bulk it out and work with in terms of remediation. Because some of the mushrooms that we see show up on contaminated sites might be also saying to us that they have an appetite for what might be there. Not always, but it might kind of lean towards that, or at least be more tolerant to that environment. And just kind of, again, paying attention to who are you seeing kind of showing up. And again, just because nature has a plant or a mushroom there, it does not mean that they are the remediators. They might be filling another function, right? But it's still important kind of information to just kind of to pay attention to. And I would say in the places that you live, even try taking a walk and seeing sites that are more degraded and more damaged, and see if you're always seeing the same plants, and kind of, take note of that, and kind of, I don't know, I think it's just a good thing to understand, and maybe just file away if you ever want to kind of test any of those plants and work with them in the future. Now, also in a site assessment, are there old structures on sites? That's important, right? If you see like an old shed with a bunch of empty rando cans of paint or weird cleaning products, that's going to tell you that you might have a problem in terms of spillage and weird things. You know, also different structures can tell us what the use and activities were on a site. So important to kind of look at that as well. Are there debris piles on your site? And if there are, what's in them? That can give you a lot of information, again, on what contaminants might be present based on the kind of waste that might be there. Are there any strange, unidentified substances on site? And I would also say similarly, like, is your site next to a railroad or a road where there could be dumping, where there could be things that are kind of being spilled or dumped? That's another piece to be aware of, because that can mean that that's something that you don't see on the site or that you don't know from the history could also impact your site. So lots of questions. And again, you can really get into this in a fascinating way. And then even from like a more biological side of things, what's going on with the sun on your site? Is your site a sunny site? Is it partially sunny? Is it shady? What's happening with that? Because that's going to also give you a lot of information as to what kind of plants you might be able to work with versus is this a good site to maybe work with saprophytic fungi? If it is a dry, sun-baked site, that's going to be an uphill battle working with our decomposer fungi. Maybe not with some of our native fungi, but definitely with, oyster mushrooms and things like that. We might want to go more for plants, mycorrhizal fungi and other things. If it's a really shady site, could do more with fungi, could do things like ferns and such. So that really matters. And that's going to switch, again, what you can work with and how you can work with it. How water flows through your site is really important because is there water coming onto your site from something uphill or upstream that is contaminated? So even if you're doing good work on your site, there's this constant bringing of contamination onto your site. And if that's the case, do you want to find a way to filter or block that? And also, if you're worried about contaminants on your site, do you want to find a way to keep water from flowing off your site? Because you don't want to impact kind of what's downstream. So the water flow is important. And then finally, I would say, how do humans use and interact with your site? Because as I mentioned earlier, humans are a wild and chaotic, beautiful force. And if you don't kind of plan for how they're going to interact with your site, it could be challenging. So really being like, is this a site that's already being utilized? And if so, how do we kind of work with that and do remediation in a way that's respecting everybody, right? Or educating folks and things like that. So that's just a little bit about site assessment. And I'm going to share these slides so that this is easier to kind of go through at a later date. Now, moving from site assessment, you've done that, you've looked at your site. And again, I think part of the thing for site assessment that's important in doing your history and looking at a site is it also gives you a bit of an idea of what you want to test for in terms of who might be the likely culprits that you're worried about. And also even where you want to test. If you don't have tons of money and you can't test the whole site, but you've identified certain areas that are more of a concern than others, like maybe there's a place where a house burnt down or a structure burnt down, right? Or there was a dump site over here, that will give you information in terms of your soil testing plan, both in terms of what contaminants you're testing for and where you're taking your samples. So that site assessment really plays into this. When it comes to soil testing, again, there's a list of steps, and it shouldn't all say one. It should say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's like a typo. But when we're testing our soil, again, we're really, at this point, we're trying to really focus on like the actual contaminants as well as how much of them are in the soil. Because there can be contaminants present, but they might not be at a threshold or a quantity that is dangerous and that could actually do harm. And so knowing that is important. Because you don't have infinite resources and time, and you want to focus kind of where it's the most critical. And we'll talk about kind of how some of those different thresholds. So with soil testing, first of all, you want to test your sites. You want to select where you're going to test on your site, and you can make a map or a diagram and really mark that out, flag it, make sure that you kind of have an idea of kind of where each sample is coming from. You want to contact a soil testing laboratory, either a university that you're working with or a private lab. And it's important to contact a lab, whether it's university or private, to also let them know what you want to test for. And they might have protocols and say, we want you to put it all in this type of bag or in this type of jar, or we'll send you the thing to put it in, right? And so it's important to kind of hear it from them, kind of what you need to do so that you don't do all the work and then send them something they can't actually use. So that's an important step, as well as see if they'll give you a discount potentially or do it for free. You then want to determine what is your sampling strategy. And we'll talk about, there's 2 main ones that we'll differentiate against. And then you collect the samples, you mail them or drop them off at the lab, you wait for your results, which can take a couple weeks or less, and then you analyze them. And the one thing with soil tests that they do not send you, it's rare, I've seen that you get soil test results back where they've actually told you what's wrong. They just give you a bunch of numbers and you have to kind of figure it out yourself. And so that's where people, I think, get overwhelmed by soil testing and they say, oh, this is too difficult. And there are ways around that. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so as I mentioned, similar to like the site assessment, trying to figure out where you're going to test, look for some of those hotspots or those places where you're like, I am quite concerned about what happened here because there's stained soils, maybe there's weird odors, you're seeing lots of trash and debris. Maybe you're seeing a burn patch and actually the evidence of something that was burned. Maybe you're seeing old equipment, pipes and tanks, or you're seeing dead and dying plants. Like whether it's a bald spot where there's nothing growing or the plants in that area look like they're struggling harder than anywhere else. Those are all good places to say, hey, that might be a good spot. Doesn't mean there isn't contamination elsewhere because contamination doesn't always show itself and announce itself very obviously, but these are kind of good signs to be like, if there's something wrong, let's try looking at these spots at least if we're going to focus anything. Then, you want to, again, pick these spots on your map and kind of decide where you're going to go. Often you pick some of these hot spots and then you pick a few random spots on your site to kind of give you the best idea of kind of generally what is going on. Now, in terms of a sampling strategy, there's like two main things I like folks to know about. You can do what we call an individual sampling strategy or a composite sampling strategy. And I'll just skip forward for a second. So the difference between individual and composite. So an individual sampling strategy, I don't know if you can see my little cursor, but individuals, you just take a bunch of samples from different spots and they're separate samples. So sample 1, 2, 3, 4, you could do a grid pattern, you could do lots of different patterns, but you take, let's say, 9 samples from, a good distribution on your site, and you send in each of those 9 samples to the lab, and you end up with like 9 different results in terms of like, these are the different metals or chemicals for each of these. That's your single, kind of sample model. That works if you have a lot of money or you have good funding for soil testing, because the more samples you can do, the better idea you get of what's going on. The less samples you do means that you could do a few samples here and there, and you could miss a very contaminated spot and somehow think your site is fine, right? So the more you can do, the better distribution you get, the more eyes you understand kind of what's going on. Now, when funding is an issue, because soil testing can be expensive, there is the option to do what we call a composite sample. And that is where you take multiple samples, kind of like you see here where they've done like, let's say 9 samples, and then they mix all of that sample in a bucket. So they put all the different 9 samples in a bucket, they mix it together, and then they take from that one sample that they send to the lab. And you can do that actually like with 3 different sections where you do each section, you do a composite, so you have a little bit more kind of distinction, instead of like one for the whole site. But it means that instead of sending lots of samples in, you're sending in less, but you're still kind of getting an idea of like, is there contamination on this site? You might not know where the contamination is, but you're getting a more general idea that there's contamination on the site with limited funds. So that is the difference between kind of the individual versus the composite sampling strategy. And again, I think one is like, if you have the money, go with an individual sampling strategy. If you're short on money, you might want to do 1 or 2 individuals and then go the rest with composite, just to kind of, stretch it out and just try to understand what's going on. And then again, the difference is individual will give you that real distinct clarity of like where these different hotspots are. Composite will tell you that you maybe have a problem, but you're going to have to apply like a more common strategy, and you're not going to be able to target the same way because you're not going to have that very specific location, but still a really good thing to do. So that's the kind of the sampling strategy piece. And then also when we come to actually measuring and taking those samples themselves, if we're just looking at what is the exposure risk on a site, the top 3 to 6 inches is where you want to take your sample from. If we're looking at growing food on that site, you can go 12 to 24 inches down, just to kind of get like the root system of a plant, and it's going to be drawing from that soil, and you want to make sure that that soil is clean, right? And there's not kind of pulling up of contamination. When we often sample for heavy metals, we are storing that in, it could be Ziploc bags. When we're working with chemicals, they tend to be stored in glass, and put in a cooler. But that's something where you want to talk to the soil lab, and they'll give you the instructions, especially for chemicals. And yeah, it's important to know, because you don't want to, again, do the wrong thing. You send it in and you wasted your time. Now, you don't need the most high-tech things to do soil testing. You need things like a clean bucket, a hand trowel, spoon, shovel, things like that. And one thing I think, just to be really clear, and I've included on the course website under the contaminants and soil testing section, which is at the beginning, I've included kind of some videos of how you do this, because I think it's a lot easier to watch in a video form. But one of the key things is you want to be cleaning whatever you are taking your samples with. You want to be cleaning that between samples. So you don't want to be taking like the same trowel and being like, I dug here and I dug there and I dug there, because you're cross-contaminating. So you want to actually clean them off between samples. And you might even want to, if you're using a bucket for different composite samples, you might want to bring multiple buckets or clean that bucket in between that, because again, otherwise you're going to get a bit of drift and you don't need that. So like really simple things you're working with. And there are also devices, if you're going deeper, there's some different tools you can use, but this is more for the like, smaller, uh, shallower kind of sampling. Now, other pieces you want to remove, if you're doing samples, remove any surface vegetation and obvious debris, right? Like you don't want to have like some big chunk of something in your sample, because that'll really, skew your sample. I already mentioned using a different trowel or scoop or spoon, or washing it between samples is important. If you're doing a composite sample, that's less important for that sample, because you're less worried about that kind of cross contamination. And I already mentioned this, but with testing, I highly recommend you try to get a university to give you free testing if you can. I've had some luck with that, and I've also not. It really depends on the university. It depends on the program. But if you can get a university, especially when we're doing chemicals. So heavy metal testing is cheaper than testing for chemicals. The moment you start testing for things like PAHs, dioxins, PFAS, the cost goes way up between samples. And it's less for heavy metals. And we're often able to find, there are programs, I think, especially in the United States, not so much in Canada, but there are programs that will do free kind of lead testing, but not necessarily like do all the other metals. We were really lucky in Canada, in Victoria, there was a program called Healing City Soils that was actually doing free heavy metals testing for residents, which was great when it came to soil, but that's not always available. But there are soil labs in universities. There are professors who are really excited about mycoremediation or phytoremediation or microbial remediation. And so sometimes you can access them, or agricultural extensions are another one, to try to reach out and say, hey, we have this great project. Would you be willing to work with us on it? And then I've also worked with private labs where I've gotten discounts. So one project that I was doing with this amazing group up north, the Skeena Watershed Conservation Coalition, we got some folks from them on this course. We were working on a creosote mycoremediation project where we were trying to use fungi to break down creosote rail ties. And we connected with a lab that we couldn't get free university testing. We tried, but we found a private lab that gave us 50% off, which was still better than nothing given how expensive something like creosote is to test. So those are some options. And again, I think different cities will have different options. Some cities, I think, have more than less, right? Now, there are also some kind of devices for the field that people can actually purchase, or projects can purchase. And I have another slide on that, but these are things like the HANBI soil and water field test kits that test for hydrocarbons. And that's something where you pay quite a bit of money up front, but then you actually have the ability to conduct some tests kind of in the field, right? And there's also, you've heard maybe in the last class, we were talking about XRFs and doing heavy metal testing with the field XRF. And that's a way to get, again, some of that heavy metal data in the field in a more mobile way and be less dependent on like a major lab or something. And again, cost money up front. If you can get a grant to cover it, then you're in a really interesting position to, have some access to this testing where it's a bit cheaper. I haven't seen any field test kits when it comes to things like PFAS or dioxin. But with PAHs or TPH, total petroleum hydrocarbons, and metals, there are a few options. And then final thing I'll say on the testing, it is very important to be very clear with what you are asking a lab to test for. Never assume that they know what you're asking. So don't just say, send them a soil test and say, I want you to soil test this, because then you'll get awkwardly, your data will come back and they tested for, minerals in the soil like NPK, and they won't give you actual metals, right? You have to reach out to that lab and say, do you test for the following contaminants? And they'll say, oh, yes, that's this test, a CAM17 metal, and you test for this when it comes to hydrocarbons. And you have to be very explicit in what you're asking, because otherwise you don't get what you ask for. And I've done this and I've made that mistake. So I don't want anyone to waste their time or their money and not, get an agricultural test and not get your actual contaminant test. Now, when it comes to analyzing your results, this is where people get a little bit cagey, because they're like, what is safe? What are these safe levels? So I managed to do a soil test, and I get something back with all these different numbers. And just an example, this is an example of a soil test from a bioremediation colleague, Cheetah Chuddy, he did up in Butte County after the 2018 Camp Fire. This is what you get sent, but without the little things in red. They just give you a list of numbers. And it's kind of like, well, what does that actually mean? And so it is important to know what are some of these safe standards for different heavy metals and different chemicals. And you can see through these are two, like in Canada, the people who come up with what we call the safe standards for some of these different heavy metals is the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, the CCME. And then in the United States, it's the EPA, right? The Environmental Protection Agency. But you can see the discrepancy between the two, right? So in Canada, our safe levels for lead are, I think it's like 70 for agriculture and 140 for residential, right? In terms of parts per million. In the United States, it's 400. That's a pretty big difference, right? And I know some American remediators who go off the Canadian numbers, because it kind of shows you that this is based on lobbying a lot of the time. And it's also based on some places already having a certain level of contamination, like in the major cities in America, because of, coal and different things like that, there are high levels of lead in the soil. And if the EPA were to put that number lower, there would be a lot of outcry and folks having to clean things up. And that would fall on different government, agencies and, local, state, federal, and they don't want to do it. So they put the number higher, right? In Canada, our cities are a bit younger in certain ways or whatnot, so we have lower numbers. And then you can see even in Europe, there's some differences here as well. But I would suggest on some of these, like take the lead option that's the Canadian one, because 400 is high. That is high. And if you're looking at, 140 versus 400, or even 70 versus 400, that's a big difference. What's interesting in Canada is our arsenic safe standard is much higher than America, right? It's 12 in Canada and it's something like 0.4. I think some states have it even less than America. And the reason why arsenic is so high as a safe standard in Canada is that we have a lot of places that have naturally occurring arsenic in the soil, where there's already quite the baseline arsenic. And so I think that's probably why that got kind of pushed up. But yeah, you can just see there's some really big discrepancies, like Canada, 45 parts per million for nickel, whereas the EPA says 1,600 is okay. Zinc, Canada says 250. The EPA says 23,000. Like, whew, So up to you which one you want to go off, whether you want to take your EPA if you're the United States, you want to go off the Canadian numbers, you want to do both, up to you. But this is kind of like you'll get your soil test and then you have to kind of pick a number that you're kind of comparing it against. So again, looking at what Cheetah's testing, he did like what we call it CAM17 for metals. That's like the 17 most common metals, right, that they'll test for. And he was using the Canadian standards. And so you can see here that he got 300 milligrams per kilogram or parts per million of lead. And that would be okay technically by American standards, but he went off the Canadian number, which is 70 or 140, depending on if you're going agricultural or residential, and said, I'm going to work on lead. That's going to be one of the metals I have to work on, right? Nickel, he went off again, Canadian numbers. There was 67. Canadian standards are 45. So yeah, it's just kind of pick your poison. When it comes to chemicals, the safe standards for chemicals are harder to find and can really vary. in terms of different states and different countries. And there is some chemicals where they actually don't have a standard for. They're like, we don't know what's safe. And so it's harder to figure it out, I think, when it comes to chemicals, whereas it's a lot clearer when you're looking at your heavy metals. So again, compare your metal or your chemical levels to the safe guidelines, whether that's the Canadian or the American, or if you're in another country, you know, see how yours stack up in terms of their integrity, right? If they're way higher than, you know, other standards, then you might want to think about who you want to use. It is important to consider the background levels of metals that may already be present in certain areas. So I mentioned in Canada, there are certain areas that have a lot of arsenic already in the soil. And so if the safe level of arsenic is 12 and you're looking at certain places where, you know, you're seeing like a 12 or a 13 from your test, it's important to be like, if that's already a naturally occurring situation, you might not have to worry as much as if it was an area where that's not happening. And then that shows like quite a big kind of addition in there. Soil pH is also really important to understanding how much you have to worry about some of these metals, especially when they are very close to the threshold. So if they're a big difference, like if it's the difference of, let's say, look at this, like, you know, 300 to 70, pH doesn't matter really in that situation. But if you're looking at, you see here, like the antimony, where it's like 25 is the result, but, you know, the safe level is 20. And there's a, you know, a situation where it's like pH is a factor and it could either immobilize or kind of make it more available. That is where it really matters in these really close calls. And we talked about this in kind of phytoremediation, but that whole piece of we have cationic metals and we have anionic metals. So when we're dealing with things like lead and cadmium and copper and zinc, and we have acidic soils, those metals are going to be more active. And so if they are in higher quantities and the soil pH is acidic, it's going to be a lot more worrisome because that means that they are able to move and they're able to get up into plants and into water, right? But if they are kind of a bit above, but not too much, and the soil is quite alkaline and they're immobilized, that would be less of a concern. So the soil pH is important to look at. And when you are getting your soil tested, also do test your pH because that might give you a bit of understanding of, again, what do you prioritize in your actual remediation. And then final thing I'll say just on kind of analyzing, it is important to ask, you know, if you're working with a university or a private lab and they give you a bunch of weird numbers, you can just email them back and say, should I be worried? Help me understand this. And oftentimes they are willing to walk you through it a little bit because some of the folks who work in these places are very passionate about what they do and they can sometimes provide that. So I know with creosote, when we did our tests up north for creosote, we got some really weird numbers back in terms of different PAHs and VOCs, and I had no idea if we should be worried or not. And we just reached out to the lab and said, what do you know? And they told us in one email and gave us the numbers and said, this is what your concerns are. So, you know, never hurts to ask for a bit of help. And then final slide with soil testing before we move into talking about health. But this is, I was mentioning how there's some field testing options for soil testing. So again, I think when we were talking in the wildfire portion, I think you heard folks say the word XRF a lot. That is what a field XRF looks like. It's like this little gun. You point down at the soil, you get some cool readings about heavy metals. It's harder than it looks, right? There needs to be training and there's some quite technical aspects. But, you know, something like this can really, if a community group gets it, it can really kind of open up the ability for folks to know different heavy metals and what's going on. And so that's an option if you want to get like, you know, I don't know, $15,000, $30,000, $10,000 to $30,000 and get one of these. That is something. And then these Hamby test kits, these are for hydrocarbons. And they are really interesting. They kind of won't tell you necessarily how much of a hydrocarbon is present, but they will tell you based on kind of how the color changes, the different hydrocarbons that it may be, like whether it's jet fuel or diesel or you know, something like that. And this can be a really helpful tool for folks who are worried, like if you're living somewhere where there might be like, you know, pipeline spills or oil spills, or like buy some kind of project where shit's always getting in the water and they're not telling anybody and it's a hydrocarbon situation. This is an interesting tool to have at your disposal to kind of have some information on what's going on and to at least be able to identify the presence of something. So helpful for that. And then when we go really low tech, and some folks get very excited. I have not done this, but this is actually something I want to get a lot more information on. There are folks who do what we call plant assays, where they basically, some plants, you plant them in different levels of contamination and they will show, they'll fail to grow in some and you can kind of see how they're doing based on the level of contamination. And that's like when you really don't have the ability to test, that can be a way to kind of say, we know that this plant grows, a certain way at a certain rate, certain coloration when we have healthy soil versus when we have some of these higher concentrations, and you're getting more of a bit of a visual representation of what that contamination is doing. And then you're using those plants as indicators of contamination. And so this could be a really great strategy in places where you can't afford testing or testing is not available. We've been talking about this in places like Gaza, right? Where it's like, can't access testing right now, but is this something that is possible? So a few more low tech options if you can't just like send your sample away to a soil lab. Okay, now final information segment before we go to Q&A, because I'm sure there's questions about soil testing. But I wanted to end the kind of the information part of this course and leave enough time for soil testing and for also the groovy mycopsychology piece. I wanted to end this on self-care and detox because this came up a lot when we were talking about the wildfires in our last class in terms of the toxicity that people get when they're having to be impacted by different environmental disasters, or whether you're living in a neighborhood where there is kind of, extreme energy projects or refineries or, long-standing contamination in terms of pollution, radiation, things like that. And so it's really important to try to support the body as best we can to detox and to just have resilience, because these contaminants, they wreak havoc on us, all of us, in different ways. And so when I say self-care, I mean both self-care and community care, because we're also trying to keep our friends and families and, people that we work with safe. But I want to just share a bit of information on this and also say that I am not a healthcare practitioner, so this is stuff that has been shared with me, but you should always check in with your medical professionals or your alternative care folks. But I just want to share a few things around detox and different plant and medicinal mushroom and food allies to support our bodies. So when it comes to self-care, again, this work, we are around toxicity, and we are always around toxicity because of what is in our world, what is in our food, the fact that there's microplastics and glyphosates and PFAS on literally everything. That is like, we're already swimming in it, but there are certain things that can really spike your exposure, like fire events, like oil spills, like a chemical fire, or, just being in a place where you're constantly dealing with that, or working and doing a bioremediation project where there is contamination. And we can limit our exposure. And it's important that we do, because that's what gives us the ability to keep doing this work and be healthy. And once we lose some of that resilience and that ability to kind of handle toxins, it's hard to get that back. So I think everything you do to limit your exposure and to protect yourself kind of counts towards future hustle. So most important thing is to limit exposure. And with that, it's wearing the proper protective gear if you are working in potential or known contamination. Even if that gear is not cool, it is necessary and really important. So we'll talk a bit about what we call PPE, personal protective gear. It is important to stay hydrated, and it's also important when it comes to limiting exposure to have a good decontamination protocol if you've been out working in contamination or responding to like a crisis or a disaster that is having contamination. And then another aspect of this is supporting and strengthening some of the key organs in the body that handle detox and that help our bodies process these different chemicals and metals and contaminants. And first and foremost, liver is like kind of one of those number one organs to support. We have to think about our lungs, our kidneys, our skin, and also things like the endocrine system, which is kind of dealing with all the hormones and can get really out of whack, especially when we're looking at some of the chemicals that we deal with in terms of PFAS and phthalates and VOCs. But it's important to kind of support these systems to be healthy. Now, when it comes to protective gear, This is not what you would have to wear if you were working on a garden project that had a bit of lead on it. This is not necessarily what you'd have to wear. But if you were dealing with a post-wildfire situation where there is a lot of, ash and debris that has not been removed, if you're dealing with an oil spill, which is like, you do not, like the first 72 hours of an oil spill is like the most dangerous time to be there in terms of what is in the air. You do want to suit up properly, right? And this is any chemical spill, not just oil. But any kind of, again, like situation where you have active contaminants that have just been released, heavy metals, chemicals, you want to protect your inhalation, your lungs first and foremost. A lot of things get in via our lungs. That's kind of like the number one pathway. And that's why we say to folks, like, wear a respirator. And you can wear respirators with kind of like VOC filters. That might be a really helpful thing. And if you don't have that, an N95 is better than nothing, right? But you do want to protect your lungs because that will do you a lot of good. And then there are certain suits like Tyvek and Tycam suits that are worn in like more hazmat situations. And the whole point of this is that they are protecting our skin and covering our skin and our clothing so that we're not getting these contaminants on us and kind of being absorbed. So that is also important. Same thing, like, don't wear flip-flops to a chemical situation. So closed-toed shoes and boots. Shouldn't have to even say that, but I've been on settings where people do bring flip-flops. Wear gloves. You just want to, again, cover your shit up. You do not want your hands, your feet, your body exposed. And I will also say you see a lot of these kind of Tyvek and Tycam suits have a hood because you want to protect your hair. Your hair is like, especially with things like certain things like hydrocarbons, it will just like suck it up. People actually make hair mats and use it to suck up oil in some kind of non-conventional oil spill cleanup. So it's like really important to like cover your hair. If you don't have a hood situation, you can do shower cap, you could do some kind of hat. But the more that's exposed, the more, again, it's just one more pathway to something sitting on you and with you and kind of getting inside where you do not want it to get. So that is really important. And then the other key piece when you're wearing PPE is that you use it properly. Like people always talk about with respirators, like, and any kind of like masks, if you got a big burly beard, it's not going to work the same way. You might want to deal with that. If you are getting really hot in your PPE, because it can be hard to work and breathe and some of that, and you're always taking it off. That happened a lot in the BP Gulf Horizon spill down in Louisiana. They had cleanup workers who were wearing these suits and their PPE, and because they weren't used to wearing it, they kept taking it off because it was so hot and they couldn't manage in it, right? If you don't use it properly and if you're taking it off all the time, you are being exposed, right? So it is something to kind of be mindful of. But if you are in a high contamination situation, this is what you want. And I'll say if you cannot access a Tyvek or a Tychem suit because you got to order a way special for that, even like a rubber rain suit, you're not Gore-Tex, but like straight up rubber, and you just tape the sleeves and things and make sure like that's better than nothing, right? So, you can get creative, but the key here is things are not getting into your clothes and onto your skin, and they're not getting into your lungs as much as possible. And in any situation, those early days and weeks are when things are quite volatilized. And you want to avoid that. You want to keep avoiding because we know communities who are living around this for decades are also getting really sick because there is that constant exposure. But definitely in the early exposures, you really want to suit up in a good way. Now, here's an example at a post-fire situation. There's a what not to do and what's a bit better. So the man on the left has a respirator, has a mask, which is good. Wearing gloves, which is good, but as you can see, there's a lot of skin showing, right? Not so good. So would love to cover him up. The lady on the right, she has a lot of good things going in terms of she's wearing one of those suits we're talking about, taped up, good. Like her gloves are actually like nitrile gloves, like in terms of water and fluids can't get in. Good mask. But you see that hair, that needs to be covered too, right? But otherwise, that's looking pretty good. Also, really recommend people wear some kind of sunglass, goggles, eyeglasses, anything, because you don't want things kind of getting in your eyes. Eyes are very sensitive. They also say with some of these contaminants, our skin, again, is one of the organs that really can soak things up. Lungs and skin in terms of how things are getting in terms of contaminants. And the parts of our skin that are the thinnest parts, kind of that's the easiest entryway. And they talk about the back of the neck, the face, and the throat. So you want to try to cover that up or at least clean that off as quick as you can. Now, I mentioned decon. So if you are in a very toxic situation, you want to, suit up and wear all this stuff. And even if you can't wear all this stuff, you still need to decon with whatever you're wearing, right? Because this is a really important step. You don't want to do everything you're doing and then just, go inside and start playing with your dog and track it inside the house. They found with firefighters that just simply them taking their shoes off after, a call and before going into their house decreased the contamination they were bringing in, right? So it is really important to take off protective clothing outside if possible. Don't necessarily give your neighbors a show, but like if you can kind of get that out, instead of bringing it in, leave it in the garage, backyard, something like that. That's important. You want to leave your protective gear in a well-ventilated space if you're not going to be disposing of it. You want to leave your shoes outside and not use those shoes for other things, also really critical. Washing your hands is important. And then take a shower as quick as you can to get anything that could have gotten on off your skin. And one of the key pieces with showers is you want to do a cold shower. I know it doesn't sound very pleasant, but when you do a hot shower, it opens your pores and things are more likely to get all up in there. And cold shower is not going to do that. So again, you're really trying to get things off you, not inside you. And then you change into clean clothing and try to relax. But that's, some initial, the simple version of a decon protocol. People have, I think, more extensive versions of that. But, even if you're just taking some of these to heart, it's better than nothing. Now, moving more into detox and how do we like support our bodies and there's both having resilience to this toxicity and also trying to move it out. There's this concept that people talk about where it's like our bodies have not, we have like a finite ability to handle toxicity. And we have what we call like a toxic load. And our body's ability, we can handle a certain amount of toxicity over our lifetime. And that toxicity comes from very, different things, right? It can be in the air that we breathe. It can be different chemical toxins that are coming from, different industrial exposures to pesticides, to the cleaning products that we use and the laundry detergents that we use. You know, there's mold, there's a whole bunch of different things that are kind of impacting our toxic load. So is stress. Stress is part of that as well. Getting sick and different viruses can kind of increase and kind of stress our system. So we just have our body can handle only so much. And what we want to do is the things that we can reduce, we want to reduce so that we have some space for some of the things that we don't have control over. We don't always have control over pesticides that are being used by multi-corporations or what's in the air or fires that are burning really far from us, but that are bringing smoke. We don't have control over that directly, but we do have control over some of the things that we, use ourselves personally in terms of cleaning products and, what we put on our lawns. And so it's important to kind of mitigate, reduce where you can. And then also understand that when people start to see symptoms where they're really struggling with, let's say, increased sensitivity to different chemicals or something called multiple chemical sensitivity or things like that, that's because they've reached kind of this toxic load and they have a lot less to work with and the body's really starting to respond and react. Now, when it comes to detox, there are different things that influence our ability to detox, and we are all different. And different people have different capacities for detoxing and excreting toxins. Like when I think about detox, it's like we are getting the stuff that's coming into us, we're getting it out. And what's really interesting is you can take two people, put them in the same situation in terms of contamination, and one person is going to be able to kind of move through that and not have many symptoms, and another person is going to really end up with a lot of issues after. And it has to do with everybody has kind of a unique capacity, and that capacity to excrete and to kind of detox their body is based on kind of their total load. So, what have they already been exposed to in their lifetime? Did they grow up in a neighborhood that had multiple refineries and kind of toxic exposures that have already started loading them up, right? That could be a part of it in terms of like they have, I look at it like there's those different barrels. Everybody has a different size barrel, or that barrel is already filled to different levels. And then we get to a certain place where it can't hold water anymore, right? And that's where we're in that danger zone. So what people have already been exposed to is going to impact like how well they can get rid of things and their ability to detox, because if they're already under a lot of stress and dealing with a lot, that's going to be impacting their system. We also have genetic differences that some people have, less ability to detox. Like they don't have certain enzymes and enzyme pathways functioning properly that would make the enzymes that can break down some of these different contaminants. I have that problem because I respond to things like volatile organic compounds really badly. There's a lot of contaminants that I am like a canary in a coal mine. And it's because my body doesn't have the same ability to clear them because of some of these kind of genetic issues, right? So that is something to kind of be mindful of, right? Also, our ability to detox, the exposure amount and the contaminant type. So some people might be pretty good at excreting or dealing with toxins, but they get such a acute and severe exposure all at once that it just blows them out. And we see that a lot with oil spill workers, right? Where they have such a high exposure that it just kind of takes them to the top of what they can handle. And then they end up with things like multiple chemical sensitivity, liver problems, cancers, all these different things. So the exposure amount as well as the contaminant type. Some contaminants are worse than others in terms of how they act in the body or how quickly they do damage in the body. People's pre-existing health conditions can also play a role in terms of if they already have kind of issues going on with their liver or their lungs, if they have issues where their body, makes too much histamine, or they have like something like mast cell activation. This is going to make that, they're going to be reacting a lot more to contaminants and they're going to struggle more. And then I would also say age is a very important factor because if we look at our total load, when you're younger, you have more room to play with. And as you get older, you're just kind of absorbing certain things and it's just kind of holding. Especially if you're not detoxing or doing things that are getting rid of it, it's the older you are, the less maybe resilient you might be to some of this. Although I think we all have examples of like elderly folks in our lives who could literally bathe in formaldehyde and be fine. My mom's one of them. So it's different strokes for different folks. But we're not all the same. And I think we have to respect that, like, some people are more sensitive to these contaminants and rightfully so. Like they're actually alerting us that these are dangerous. And some folks have the ability to weather a lot. And we have to figure out how to kind of really take care of people. Now, I mentioned one of the key things they always say with folks, if you have been exposed to stuff or you're around a lot of contaminants that you can't really control, or you're just doing this work a lot, try to find ways to reduce exposures where you can, right? So in your home, in your car, these are just like ways you can reduce your exposure will give you more space to kind of take on more. Avoiding products with fragrance is like the easiest thing. Fragrance is something where you see it in almost everything these days, but it is not just a happy, I smell good. It is actually chemicals. It's volatile organic compounds, it's phthalates, and in some situations like laundry detergents, it's PFAS. And that's one of those things that like, if you use less of that, it's better for everyone, but it's especially better for you. If you are dealing with contaminants, try to avoid and reduce your smoking, your drinking, and your sugar. And smoking because of your lungs and its impact on your lungs. And then drinking and your sugar, it impacts your liver. Like that is stuff that the liver has to deal with, and your liver is already being impacted by all the contaminants that it's taking on, right? So that's another thing where you can kind of help your body out. Even trying to reduce things like plastics and microplastics will give you a bit more space. And this is everything from like avoiding, getting heated beverages in plastic or paper cups, because we know that if we put hot beverages in a plastic cup, it just leaches a lot of microplastics. And then in the paper cups, they're lined with plastic and it does the same thing. Avoiding things like black plastic. If you see like black plastic utensils, that's actually made from electronic waste. And so it has not just plastic, but heavy metals. So you don't want to have hot things in that. Like just those are little things. Like use cookware that isn't Teflon and nonstick, because that's just a whole shit ton of PFAS. Like kind of dropping these things can actually help give your body a bit of a break. And then on the eating side of things, where possible and where affordable, because it's really unaffordable for food right now, try to eat cleaner, right? Because again, those pesticides and everything that we're taking in and heavy metals that we're taking in via food is just adding to that toxic load, and it gives us less to work with all those uncontrolled exposures. So, people talk about like, if you can buy organic or grow your own, that's always better, but it's not very affordable. But there are, some fruits and vegetables that we know are more clean than others, right? And kind of maybe being, careful with that. Even things like with your greens and your berries, like soaking them in baking soda and water and then rinsing them, that can help get rid of some of the pesticides that are on them. Even just peeling apples, peeling potatoes, peeling carrots can get some of that physical pesticide residue and heavy metals off the skin and give you a bit of a healthier thing. And with things like animals and meat, avoiding the skin or the fatty parts, because a lot of the chemicals, especially things like dioxin, tend to concentrate in the fatty parts of animals. So those are just like quick things in terms of what can you avoid that will give you a bit more space to, I don't want to say play, but like take on other things. Now, when it comes to actual, like you're dealing with detox, you feel like you've been around some contaminants and you're trying to help your body get rid of them, which is really important. I want to start off by saying that detoxing can be really hard on the body, so don't like be careful. And if you're going to do some really intense detoxing, you want to talk to like a naturopath or an herbalist and actually have someone give you some good tips with it. But I was talking to a naturopath because they're very expensive. So I just want to share what I was told because not everybody can afford that. But one of the key things with trying to detox heavy metals and contaminants out of your body is you need to be able to actually get them out of your body. And folks seem to forget that. People start taking all these herbs and all these supplements, being like, I'm sucking up the heavy metals. And it's like, well, if you suck them up, but they can't get out, that is just going to be more internal pain. And so the first thing that you should always make sure you can do when it comes to detox is that your elimination pathways in your body, the natural elimination pathways, are actually open and moving. And how we actually get rid of contaminants in our body is through our urine, like peeing, pooping, like getting it out that way is actually number one, and through our skin, right? Like sweating. And so if any one of those things are compromised, especially if you can't poop, poop is like the number one. If you cannot poop, do not attempt to detox until you have fixed that problem. That's your first issue to fix, because that's how the liver kind of moves things out of your body, so you have to do that. And the kidneys kind of doing it through the urine. But you really want to be able to clear things. So you can't really start sucking things up and getting them out if you can't get them out. So that's number one. Make sure that you can pee a lot, that you're able to poop, there's no constipation going on, and that if you are someone who can sweat, you want to sweat. Not everybody can sweat. There's people who have, things like dysautonomia or, spinal injuries or things like that, where actually they can't dissipate heat well. And so for them, that's not going to be the way that they're getting rid of contaminants. But if that is something that works for you, people talk about sauna. Doing sauna 2 to 3 times a week is a really great way to get some of the toxins kind of out through the skin. And the critical piece there is like when you're sweating, you want to towel that sweat off or rinse off pretty quickly because you don't want it to just kind of, it's being released in the sweat. So you don't want to just have it reabsorb the body. You're trying to get it off you, right? So that is a really good way to get some detox. Drinking lots of water so you can really be passing it through urine. You can also work with different herbal kind of, diuretic teas, nothing too strong, but like nettle or something like that. And then again, eating lots of fiber so that you are pooping like a champ. I can't even emphasize how important that is to detox. Don't take a laxative though. That is too much. But you want to be just like everything's going in a good way. So once you have that and you've actually opened the body, so you're like, okay, there's open doors for things to get out of, that's when we start talking about how do we kind of suck up the toxins and bind them to something that they can be moved out of the body. And that's where you'll hear people talk about binders. And so there are natural binders, and these are things like activated charcoal, psyllium, which is a gentler thing, I think, to work with. You've heard people maybe talk about things like bentonite clay. Chia can be helpful in this way. Chlorella, cilantro, all the folks in the South, okra can be actually a good natural binder. And these basically help kind of like the contaminants will stick to it, and then it can be moved and kind of purged from the body. So that is important. One key thing with binders is that if you are taking medication, be careful because these things can also kind of suck up and hold on to your medication. And it means that that's not doing what it's supposed to do in your body. So you need to be aware of that and take them at very different times. So, and again, there's different, like I would say like charcoal and clay might be a harder thing to work with. Psyllium husk is pretty gentle. Chia is pretty gentle. Cilantro, chlorella, those are things that can be easy. Cilantro is really good. And so is chlorella when it comes to sucking up heavy metals. So that can be helpful. And then again, if all your elimination pathways are going, you got lots of fiber, you got lots of hydration, You can kind of carry these out of the body. Now, there are also certain supplements that are really helpful in detox. And one of the ones that you'll hear a lot from different practitioners is glutathione. So glutathione is an antioxidant, and our body makes it, but some people don't make enough of it. And that's one of those things I was talking about with like some people detox differently. There are some folks who just don't make enough of the glutathione. And as you get older, you make less of it. So it is a natural thing that you might want to supplement because it is really, really good at kind of like pulling out contamination and helping it, especially like kind of getting it out of certain parts of the body so the binders can kind of lock onto it and then move it out. And it's also an antioxidant, so really helpful in that way. Vitamin C is also really important, and so are things like NAC. NAC actually helps build glutathione. And then magnesium can be helpful in supporting the body with detox, as can zinc. But again, like, you know, if you don't want to do supplements, there are other ways to kind of get that through your food. And I will move on to that because some people supplements, it wears them out or it's too expensive. So, you know, even vitamin C is a good thing to just be like, I'm doing that. But glutathione is a really good thing to work with if you can. Now, food can be our medicine. I'm a big fan of that. And as I already mentioned, when we're trying to detox, we want to reduce things that are like inflammatory because all of these metals and chemicals are causing inflammation in our body and doing damage in terms of like to our different systems. And so this might not be for everyone, but like definitely I would say sugar, alcohol are going to be things you want to decrease because of what they do to the liver and how they impact the liver. And then if you already know you're a bit sensitive to dairy and gluten, you might want to chill that out while you're dealing with like a contamination situation. You can also add in really good natural anti-inflammatories like turmeric, garlic, and ginger. That'll also help the body in lots of ways. And then supporting your liver in general with things that are bitter. Bitter foods are really good to support the liver. And then there are herbs that are incredible for the liver. And we'll talk about that actually in a second. And we really do want to support our livers. That's like number one with this work. Also, I talked about glutathione and how important that was for detox. Onions, garlic, and cruciferous vegetables like our brassicas, like broccoli, kale, cauliflower, cabbage, could all help the body make glutathione. So even just upping that can be a helpful thing to supporting the body. And then to just really eat bright and bold, like eat bright, bold colors, lots of dark leafy greens, and brightly colored fruits and vegetables because they contain a variety of antioxidants and vitamins and minerals and compounds that are really good for supporting kind of the body when it's dealing with these contaminants in terms of inflammation, anti-cancer, things like that. So even if you're just handling it from a food perspective, you know, that's a good approach. I will say, so I mentioned the liver being one of the most important things to support because the liver takes a beating. The more toxicity it's exposed to, the more it's being impacted. I also think of the liver as like the wetlands of the body in terms of like kind of what it's doing and the beauty that it's doing. But one of the best things you can do for the liver is milk thistle. It is a seed, milk thistle seed from a thistly awesome plant. And people take tinctures of it. They take the seed and they crack it up onto like potatoes and greens. But that seed is really good at kind of helping the liver heal and really supporting it when it's being kind of impacted all the time. So that's a wonderful thing. If you're going to do one thing for the liver, just that would be a good thing to focus on. And then there's also other bitter plants that support the liver, like dandelion and burdock, different bitter greens. Anything that's a bitter vegetable is really helpful for kind of a healthy liver. And as I already mentioned, things like turmeric and garlic and ginger will also be supportive. Lots of fiber, because again, the liver is taking all those toxins and then it needs to get it out, and it gets it out by kind of the poop pathway. Like it has to excrete it that way. And so you want that fiber to kind of help it go there. There are certain medicinal mushrooms that can be helpful to the liver. People talk about shiitake especially, and maitake for that. And I already talked about some of the things around alcohol and sugar, but again, doing that sweating piece, if we're trying to get these toxins out of our body so that they don't impact our livers so much. And that can be everything from exercise to sauna and just making sure we are like getting it, rinsing it off, toweling it off. Now, our lungs, as I mentioned, another thing we have to support, especially when we're dealing with air pollution, we're dealing with smoke, chemical exposures, wildfires, all of that. And I won't go into as much detail with this, but there's a lot of really good herbs that support our lungs in kind of inflammation, in kind of clearing them. I'm a big fan of things like mullein and marshmallow. Other people love elecampane and plantain and peppermint. The list goes on. Garlic is just like good across the board. It's good for cancer. It's good for liver. It's good for lungs. So just like add the garlic in the mix. And also, I would say for lungs, there's other things that people can work with in terms of irrigating the nasal pathways, uh, essential oil steams like with eucalyptus or tea tree oil, and then acupuncture. And acupuncture, not just good for lungs, but when it comes to detox and supporting the body with toxicity in general, I'm a big fan of acupuncture. I think there's a lot of support it can offer. I don't do it myself in terms of I have it done to me, so I don't feel like I can comment on what you should do. But there is a lot of amazing practitioners who can support people in terms of their lungs, their livers, whatever system is being thrown out of whack by contamination. Now, I also want to mention when, again, we have these contaminants. So it's either if we're exposed to heavy metals or we're exposed to a lot of VOCs, dioxins, and carcinogens. What that means is it's a mix of we have to get them out of our bodies. And we've already talked about some of those ways to do that with different, binders and excretions and things. But we also have to be vigilant because now we've already had that impact. And that impact has primed us for all these different illnesses that are just a part of our society now. Like we look at, autoimmune illnesses, cancer, inflammatory illnesses. Those are all like pollution plays a huge role in a lot of those. So it kind of, you want to be preventing as much as you can. And some of the best preventative healers to work with are the medicinal mushrooms, especially when it comes to things like cancer and their ability to be anti-inflammatory, to kind of, be antioxidant, to kind of turn off kind of tumor vibes in the body. So like reishi, shiitake, turkey tail, chaga, lion's mane is incredible when it comes for brain and central nervous system. Different mushrooms for different people. But that is something that if you want to integrate that into a more regular thing in your diet as a preventative piece, it's really helpful. And again, some of our other constant supports, even if you're doing this as a more long-term thing of being like, eat lots of brassicas and onions so that you're working with that glutathione, have lots of garlic and turmeric because it's anti-inflammatory, support your liver with bitters, work with things like cilantro or parsley because they can kind of sop up and bind heavy metals and move it through your body. And always make sure you're rocking the fiber so that you have an ability to get things out, right? Lots of different options there. And then when I was talking earlier about the bright and bold colored fruits, those fruits and veggies have what I was mentioning, like antioxidants, bioflavonoids, vitamin C, glutathione, all these things that are really helpful for both detox, but also for anti-cancer and anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective and things like that. And those are all the things that come later if we don't deal with this issue, right? So there's a preventative side of this in terms of once you've been exposed, how do you make sure that nothing else happens later down the line? And just, this is only a few things to think about. I didn't want to overwhelm, but it's just some important ones. I'm going to skip. Well, I was going to say, like, when we're doing this work or when we're around issues of environmental injustice and disaster, it is stressful. And the toxic or the total load of the body is impacted by stress as well. And there are different herbs and fungi that you can work with when it comes to kind of chilling out and adapting to stress and dealing with some of the intensity of the world. I won't go into it too much because I want to make sure we have time for other things, but I just wanted to share that. So final tips on self-care, just to wrap it up. So again, it's important to limit and decrease exposures wherever possible. When we are working in contaminated environments, we want to wear PPE. And again, there's a difference between you're working on a site where there is a lot of contaminants versus a community garden where you're like, there might be some lead and cadmium in the soil. I don't have to wear a Tyvek suit necessarily for that. But you might want to wear like a N95 or a P100 because you're worried about the contaminated soil dust. And you still might want to decon after and take a shower and not wear the same clothes. Like that's still important, but it's a bit of a lower intensity than like a really active site, right? We already talked about how important it is to decontaminate. The fact that if we're going to try to get things out of our bodies, And the ways that our bodies can handle being around contamination is we need to be excreting it and getting it out as fast as we can. If we want to do that, we have to make sure that our natural elimination pathways are open first and foremost. Even if we don't have time to do all the other detox stuff, to really make sure that we are excreting what we can that's even a really, really good start. And then it's also important to say that there's different herbal and nutrition and supplements for different people. Not everybody reacts well to the same thing. Some people don't react well to glutathione, or some people don't react well to certain herbs, right? And so be mindful of that, and don't try to push something. If your body's saying no, that's a no. And you don't need to stress your body out when you're already stressed in terms of, if you're having certain symptoms that could be from too many toxins, you don't want to be adding to that. And by that same point, don't overload. So I gave you pretty long lists. You don't have to do everything on that list. If you try to detox too much or too fast, that can actually cause problems and that can make you feel sicker. And so, sometimes going gentle is better, at least to start out with. And if you have to go harder on that because of, what it's doing to your life in terms of symptoms, you want to work with a professional if you can, to like have support. And then again, these good maintenance things like exercise and sauna, if you can sauna, even certain massages can really help move things. Acupuncture can be helping your body deal with this. And there's a lot of good community acupuncture. And I didn't mention this, but like rest and sleeping. We actually can detox certain things while we're asleep. And so getting good sleep is important to this process as well. So I think that is it for that. And now we have some time for questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to do like questions. And then I'm going to, about 10, 15 minutes before we are going to end, we're going to have Maya kind of do our concluding exercise. So what do we have for questions? I don't see too many questions in the chat, which is usually a good thing because it means that people weren't really confused. But this is a good time to ask questions for everything from the course. It doesn't have to just be on what we just spoke about.
Actually, I have a quick question. Hi, everybody.
Yes. Thank you for saving us from the silence. I was like, oh, awkward. Hi, Ryan.
Hey, how are you? Sorry, I wasn't at the last few classes.
It's okay.
It got very busy. But
All
I'm
good.
watching all the videos to recap, and it's been amazing. So thank you for having this class. And
Awesome.
um, I just really I'm a super visual learner, and I also just like to be able to like rewind things over and over again and watch. Do you know if there's any, because I love like how you broke down the site assessments. Do you know if
Mm-hmm.
there's any like videos of someone walking through and doing a site assessment?
I don't know. I'll look for something.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know. But that would be a good thing to make.
I know. I'm like
Yeah.
that'd be awesome. So
Yeah, and maybe some of us who do this work on this class can make one for Ryan. Because I mean, like we all do it, right? And like that would be a really, because it's true. There's some things like soil testing, site assessment, where it's like if someone was doing it and you see it happen, it's a lot easier than someone just being like all these things, right? So yeah, no, definitely we'll think about that.
We could do that. We could make videos at
Yay.
SWCC and share them back
Yes.
with you, Lila.
Do it,
Yeah.
do it,
We'd
Anissa.
be happy.
Yay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Nina.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. Actually, it's Maggie who has the question.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Yeah, this was so great to hear all these tips for self-care and yeah, just ways to use PPE, but also like just thinking about your mental health too. And I'm curious because you've worked with so many different communities experiencing like different types of disasters.
Mhm.
I'm curious your thoughts on like the role of like community building and self-care too. And like a lot of times in disaster response, it can bring up a lot of tense emotions and everything. So I'm curious if you have any tips on like different approaches to building a strong community and what that looks like, or any.
Bro.
Oh, no.
I think Maggie cut out.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear us now?
Yes, yeah. You
Okay.
started going into robot. sound.
Sorry.
Yeah. But I got
So-
most of it, but just the last part I didn't get.
Yeah, just curious about your
Mhm.
experience because you've worked with so many different communities. Like, do you have any tips on like the role of community building in like tense times, and like, because some of it's initial, but then some of it's more long-term community building. So any advice you have on the role of that in self-care too?
Hmm. And how does self-care link to it?
I think just like mental health, like mental and emotional health.
Well, I mean, I'll say like, I mean, it really depends on the community and what the issue is. But I feel like, especially when responding to things that like post-fire or post-oil spills or things like that, I think emotions are running really high. And there's a lot of sense of like loss, and eco grief, uh, and also just like injustice too. And I think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think as community organizers who are kind of in that space, I think it is important to give people like, I mean, sometimes that's like making certain spaces available to that, or bringing in certain practitioners to support that. Like, I think that can be a really helpful approach to say, like, as we're doing this work where we're healing the land, we also know we have to heal ourselves. And maybe that's like having a community acupuncture clinic, or, like having like herbal teas that are like about supporting the body. Like, I think when people feel like other people care about them, that's helpful. And there are some situations where, like, the mental health piece is interesting because some people, like I've been in some communities, especially more rural communities, where if you're like, folks who are struggling with mental health, go here, people are like, that's not me. I will not, I don't need that, or they don't want to identify as that. So sometimes it's like finding ways to kind of bake that in, like putting on different social events where people just get to connect, or having different teas that are just in the room when you're doing different workshops, or having different action days that are those teas that are helpful for calming and for adaptogenic things. Like, I think there's the kind of the passive things or the more overt. And I think it just really depends on the community. I had one oil spill response where I came right after, it was like a rainbow gathering in this really hippie community in British Columbia. And it was like, whoa, like emotions were high and people wanted to talk about it, like they feel it, but then they also had a lot of blame for the government in terms of this spill that had happened. And the government didn't show up, but I showed up as the person they invited to talk about the spill. But because I was the only external person who showed up, I had to deal with about 30 minutes of the event, people yelling at me like I was the government. And I think that's another thing to recognize, is that if no authority figure or the actual company, or but people are actually stressed about, they feel like they lost something or something was destroyed, and the people they think who are to blame or the situation isn't there, they might actually focus that on whoever is showing up and trying to be like, I'm helping. And I think you just have to, I just let those folks kind of go for about 30 minutes. And then one person was like, she's actually here to do this other thing. And then everyone was like, oh my God, we're sorry. And then we started talking about bioremediation. And I just had to be cool with it, because I think people have to get it out sometimes. And not that any of us should be punching bags, but I think it's just understanding that people are under a lot of stress and they might not be feeling well and they might not be sleeping well. And so it's like, how do we find different ways to support that, And again, maybe it's not your team that's doing that because you're attending to something else, but you're calling in other community partners. And even in those settings, who are the community partners that you can call in, who are already known to that community, who are already folks who are, providing certain cultural supports, like when I worked in Louisiana and New Orleans, it's like, you would want to deal with some of the folks who are like the culture bearers and who are the arts folks and the spiritual leaders in that community. And you want to do it alongside them, right? Because people will be able to hold that differently and people trust them. And so I think there's so many things, And if you don't know what to do, I think, Anissa just put in the chat, like up in northern BC in the Skeena, like, using laughter and all these different things. But it's like every place is different in terms of how they want to process something and how they want to work with it, And I'll also add, sometimes like the most empowering thing for people to do, like they're in a situation where all these things have gone wrong and the land's impacted and they're really sad about what they've lost, you know. Sometimes having these action parties or people showing up to help is really helpful for their mental health, right? Like people just so they're not alone in it. And I think that can be something that is also really beautiful. But I would welcome anybody else who wants to chime in on that, because I think that's a bigger conversation in terms of a lot of people are doing this work, you know? And there's no right answer. I think to me, whenever it comes to community organizing, it's just like, don't be an asshole. Like that's like the number one rule is just come in a good way. And if you don't know what to do, try to listen and try to ask, and don't come in thundering, you know, and taking up all the air in the room. Because if you observe, you'll get a bit of a feeling for what's going on and what people might be kind of leaning towards. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Anything else? Oh, Nina also asked when we were talking about saunas, when it comes to sweating out the toxins. And that sweating out the toxins can be especially good for things like dioxin. I will add, supposedly you can't sweat out PFAS, but you can sweat out some of the things like dioxin, which is good. Sauna is, it doesn't need to be infrared. It can be just like regular old school Nordic style, like hot steam sweat. Infrared is cool. Like I think that could also add certain things, but it can just be regular sauna. And some of the naturopaths who are doing interesting work with like firefighters after different fire events. I added two videos to the Mighty Network that are of like two different kind of naturopathic folks talking about kind of their approaches to detox. And one is from the Integrated Healers Action Network in California, who's been doing a program with firefighters and trying to help them with detox, because firefighters pull in so much toxicity and have such high rates of cancer from everything they're doing. And also their actual uniforms like they wear when they're doing the firework has PFAS. It's just like a hot, intense mess. And they were actually like, in addition to doing a lot of stuff with glutathione and other things, they were having them do 2 to 3 days a week of sauna. And we're saying that was a pretty helpful path. Brend has a question. So, Brend, do you want to ask your question or you want me to read it?
Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Brenda. In
Brenda.
Houston. Yes. Sorry. I don't know why it
It's
says
all
Brenda.
good.
Yes. I'm just wondering if you know any community groups in the U.S. That are advocating for better regulations. I see that, they're much higher here. Do you know anyone that's doing that work?
I feel like I know there are. Like I would say, I'm sure there's environmental justice group, and I'm sure there's some main environmental groups that have like kind of a toxic section. But off the top of my head, I can't remember. If anybody else wants to add and respond to that in the chat, who's like more America based. I used to do a lot of environmental justice work in the States, but it's been a minute. But I definitely think that's been a constant battle in the States. To kind of be like these numbers, like we got to shift this. Javier said Los Jardines Institute in New Mexico is doing work on this, which is great. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different folks fighting for this, and Coming Clean is another group from Javier. And I think also given the current administration, I think things might get worse, especially on some of the chemical sides. I think the metals are like, people have pretty much left that alone recently, but I think with the chemicals, I think they're getting worse. And they're trying to pull back some of the, like, we have this newfound awareness around PFAS being really bad. And I think there's been some big push to kind of recently chill out any kind of mitigating, kind of more strict guidelines around PFAS. So it's definitely something to watch. Yeah, Environmental Justice Health Alliance, and Tewa Women, United Family, all good things, like New Mexico kicking ass. Thank you for sharing that, Javier. And also, if you want to actually say anything, please hop on and add to that. Okay, I think we have room for like 2 more questions before we do the groovy myco psychology somatic exercise that I don't know what it's going to be. It's a surprise. Maya's been telling me about her amazing work, and I've never gotten to see it. But do we have any other questions before we kind of do the final thing? Any burning questions? I will say, as people are starting to drop off, after this course, please feel free to reach out if you are working on things and you want information, or you're like, want to talk about your project because we haven't had maybe that much time to interact. I am around. I sometimes take a little bit of time to respond, but the best way to reach me is my email. And I'm going to put it in the chat because I don't always check the Mighty Network once the class is done. So feel free to email me if you are working on really cool things and you want to talk further about it, or there was some burning question that didn't get answered from the class. I am always excited to connect. Yes, Nina.
Hey, sorry, we have many people here.
I
So
love
this
it.
is from Lynn.
Like you're like the MC for Los
Yeah.
Angeles.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the socks and like the either the Mica socks or the compost filter socks. And I think when Maya said like you're supposed to dig it in like a couple inches, like 3 inches or 6 inches. I guess I was thinking about this because I was like thinking about implementing them on a soil that it's like a little bit of arsenic. And I was like, we already put like compost and mulch and treatments on it, and I don't really want to like dig into the soil. So I guess I was just thinking like, would it be cool to just put it on top and like stake it in? Like, is that still still like effective? Yeah.
Maya, do you want to take that? I feel like Maya's the Micah Waddle expert. So
Yeah, so
yeah.
those are, it's a form of microfiltration that's for when something is moving downhill and you want to interrupt it,
Intercept.
right?
Mhm.
So it's something that's probably in that first few inches of your soil that's moving downward through the soil downhill. So if you didn't dig into the soil, it wouldn't really be able to intervene very much. It could still, sometimes wattles are like just laying on top of pavement. Sometimes they are just put on top of the surface. And that's more just for erosion control than it's not gonna have as much impact on the contaminants, I would say.
Good.
Be my
Thank
best.
you so much.
Yeah. So I guess this is a natural segue for Maya. Take us home.
Ready for some groovy somatic, what do you call it? I love the way that Lila talks about everything as groovy when it's when it's a little woo-woo.
Yes.
But I really wanted to also just echo what you were saying, Lila, about the importance of taking care of ourselves, and to Maggie's question as well around how can we support ourselves on multiple levels, especially right after a disaster, when folks are so traumatized. And often just being in witness of these disasters can be incredibly taxing on our bodies as well as our emotional health. And so I wanted to try to feed multiple birds with one scone here, and share some techniques that can be helpful for regulating the nervous system, as well as to integrate some of our learning from this course and think about where we might want to go next. So if you'd like to, you can find yourself a comfy place to sit. It's nice if your spine can be upright, and just notice how it feels to be sitting wherever you are. Adjust if you need to. Notice if there's any part of your body that's calling for attention. And notice if there's something nagging at you, like, oh, I really want to go eat dinner, or I'm getting tired, or oh man, I was really supposed to wash the dishes tonight, whatever it is. You can just notice whatever it is that might be kind of pulling our attention and our thoughts elsewhere. And let's try to take a slow, deep breath in and release. And whenever you're ready, take a deep breath in and just take a moment to notice all of the passion, the deep care, the love. Maybe there was a sense of being a part of a movement that you felt during this course. Taking another breath in and noticing how it feels to have so much knowledge around bioremediation. Just noticing all of that intellectual stimulation, whatever it is that comes from all the learnings in this course. And when you're ready, you can take another breath in. And as you breathe out, You can send some gratitude to all of the teachers for all of the things that they brought to this course, all of the other participants for all their juicy questions and for that sense of cohesion, that cohort that we've been building. And then let's take a breath in now and release it for ourselves, for showing up, for taking time out of our lives to do something that, let's be honest, most of us aren't going to get paid for. We do this out of the need for it, out of the importance of it, and the beauty of showing up for our planet and for our people in this way. And as you give yourself that gratitude, you can also notice where it is that that sense of power, that passion, that drive comes from. A lot of people talk about the space between our belly button and our pubic bone as being like a seat of our power. It's referred to as the chi in China. And if you want to just take a moment to just find that part of yourself that drove you to be a part of this work. And give some love and appreciation to that part of you. Let's take another breath and just notice how it feels to breathe. Now we can bring our attention to our bodies and take a moment to listen if there's anything your body wants to tell you about how your body wants to interact with bioremediation work. Does it want to detox? Does it want to lessen exposure? Does it want to do certain physical tasks and not others? And now we're going to take a moment to emulate one of our bioremediation role models. These are some of our best allies, the fungi. And you can pick any kind of fungi that you want for this, as long as it has mycelium, that body of the fungus, that filamentous network. Imagine that you are actually a decentralized network. The line between where you end and the rest of your ecosystem begins is not only blurry, it's non-existent. You are connected with thousands, millions of other beings around you that feed you, hold you, water you, keep you in check, provide a sense of home, a sense of belonging. Letting ourselves just kind of sink down into that belonging. Our hyphal tips, the hyphae are the individual strands of mycelium. They're digging around, weaving their way through the soil, creating a lattice network, seeking out sources of nutrition. As they go and as they eat, as they find something that they know how to digest, they release these enzymes that unlock the different components of that piece of wood and transform it irreversibly into something that provides fertile ground for new things to grow. Our very existence, our growth, our living is a transformative force to the world around us. As we're searching around, we encounter something toxic, something that's different than anything else we've ever encountered, something that maybe makes us feel a little sick. We found a contaminant, what the humans call contaminants anyway. And instead of just running away and retreating, we observe it. We look at all angles of this new molecular structure. We touch in on the different sides of it, as if reading a book. We take that knowledge, that site assessment, and then we dip back to our ancestors, going back through all the generations of all of our relatives who came before, to see if any of them have ever encountered anything similar to this. The tools that they developed that we carry with us are not for the exact same kind of contaminant, but there are components that are priceless. Little pieces of the puzzle that we draw forward and combine with that information that we learned about this contaminant. And we adapt these ancient tools to the current situation, creating a new enzyme, a new key that can take something that was toxic for us and transform it into new life, transform it into food that we can actually even take into our bodies. That enzyme breaks apart that hydrocarbon molecule, absorbs some of the hydrogen, absorbs some of the carbon, takes in some of the minerals, and then shares the rest with the ecosystem around them. Every problem is an opportunity for transformation, for evolution, and for change on multiple levels. Coming back to our human selves, on the next breath in, think if there's a contaminant, a problem that's in your world, maybe something that inspired you to take this course, maybe something that this course inspired you to get interested in. And as you examine that problem, as you read the story, all sides of what that contaminant is or what that problem is, feel all of the ancestors that are at your back, all of the teachers and participants in this group here who are now cheering you on. We can send some of that gratitude to everybody else for the work that they're doing. Wish them well on their journey as bioremediators in the world, doing some of the most important work on our planet. Noticing all of the support that we have from the ecosystems around us, from our plant allies, our fungal allies, our microbial allies, our human allies, the other animals. So many different beings in the web of life are so grateful for this work and want to be in it with us. And it's actually only a few people in the world who don't see the importance of this work. Letting all of that resource, all of that care, all of that love from all around us, let's let some of that settle into that power spot that we found earlier. And fill up our well of resource. And the question for you to answer when we get off the call, maybe you want to do some journaling, just something that I'll ask you that you're invited to explore is how can we draw from this well of resource and adapt it to the problems that we're facing? Thank you all so much for being on this journey with me. I'm so glad I got to be a part of this course. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Lila, for your incredible wisdom and your deep love and care for this earth. And to all of you, I wish you so, so well on your bioremediation journeys.
Yay. Thank you, Maya. You brought the groove. You definitely brought the groove. And I love you for
Love
it.
some groove.
Yes. Awesome, everyone. Well, that takes us to the end of class. So yeah, really appreciate you all taking the time over this last 6 weeks to be here. The course, you have access to all the videos and the information, and there's lots of information on the website in terms of your course page. Feel free to use it. You have it for at least a year, if not longer. And as I said, please reach out if you have questions that didn't get answered and you want to chat about your projects. We'd love to hear from you. So yeah, and thank you to all the folks who have taught. Maya, I know some of the California crew.